The prairie wind whispered only of hardship across Elara's isolated homestead, a lonely sound for a widow with 2 hungry children and a heart full of dust. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. But one afternoon, a different story rode in. A cowboy, slumped in his saddle, clinging to life by a thread, with a dark crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He was a stranger, a danger, another mouth to feed. Every instinct screamed for her to turn him away, but in a moment of profound courage, Elara chose kindness, never knowing this single act would save his life and bring a miracle to her family. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you love Wild West stories. The wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from the earth, leaving behind a mosaic of cracked clay, and it stole the warmth from Elara's thin frame as she stood on her porch, a silent sentinel watching the sun bleed across a merciless horizon. Inside, her 2 children, Leo and Clara, were the only things in this world that still grew, but their hunger was a constant, gnawing presence that echoed the emptiness of the plains. Hope had long since been ground into the dust that coated everything she owned, a fine grit in her throat and a weight in her soul. The larder was nearly bare, the well was growing stubborn, and every sunrise felt less like a promise and more like a threat. It was in the suffocating heat of the afternoon that the landscape finally offered something new. A shape, dark and wavering, slowly crawling toward them. It wasn't a dust devil or a mirage. It was a horse, and on its back, a man folded in on himself as if in prayer. The animal plodded with a final, exhausted purpose, stopping just yards from her cabin before its legs buckled. The man tumbled from the saddle, not with a cry, but with a soft, final sigh, landing in a heap of leather and denim. A dark stain, the color of wet soil, spread from his side, consuming the fabric of his shirt. Her mind screamed, a stranger, danger. Every hard-learned lesson of survival told her to bolt the door, to huddle with her children and pretend they were as empty and lifeless as the homestead appeared. He was another mouth, another body that would consume their precious water, their last handfuls of cornmeal. To help him was to invite death to sit at their table. Her eyes darted to the doorway where Leo and Clara stood, small figures framed in shadow, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and a child's raw curiosity. They saw a man who was hurt. She saw the end of their world. He was a complication she could not afford, a burden that would surely break them. Let the prairie take him, the wind seemed to whisper, a cold, practical voice in her ear. But then she saw his hand, fingers twitching weakly in the dust, a last, desperate plea to a world that had abandoned him. In that small movement, he was no longer a threat or a bird. He was just a man, a soul clinging to life, and in a single, terrifying, righteous moment, Elara made a choice that defied all logic. She chose compassion. The weight of him was immense, a dead, cumbersome thing as she dragged him across the dirt, the smell of blood and sweat filling her lungs. With every straining muscle, she felt the terrible gravity of her decision, a choice that sealed their fates together. The cabin door slammed shut, a hollow boom that cut off the endless wind, trapping the silence, the danger, and a sliver of impossible hope inside with them. The firelight threw long, dancing shadows against the cabin walls, turning the small space into a cavern of fears. Outside, the wind moaned a lonesome tune, but inside, the only sounds were the hiss of water in a pot, the ragged, shallow breaths of the stranger, and the frantic beating of Lara's own heart. She worked with a grim, focused intensity, her hands moving through a ritual she never asked to learn. The water, boiled and precious, was used to clean the ugly, torn flesh of his side. The cloth she used was a strip torn from her late husband's only good shirt, a sacrifice that felt like a betrayal of memory for a future that was now terrifyingly uncertain. A splash of whiskey, saved for the bitterest cold or a sudden sickness, was her only medicine, and its sharp say mingled with the metallic tang of blood, creating an aroma of violence and desperation. This was the intimate work of saving a life, a task so profound it felt like a prayer, yet so brutal it felt like a sin. From the doorway of their small room, 2 pairs of eyes watched her every move. Leo and Clara stood frozen, their small hands clasped together, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. They were too young to understand the complexities of good and evil, but they understood pain. They saw the blood, the stranger's pale face, and the grim set of their mother's draw. Their silent, innocent witness was a stark, painful contrast to the savagery that had brought this man to their door. A quiet accusation against a world that could inflict such wounds. With every gentle press of the cloth, Elara's mind raced. What have I done? Each drop of water she used was a drop her children would not drink tomorrow. The whiskey was gone. The cloth was ruined. She was pouring their meager survival into a man who might be a devil. Was he a thief? A killer? Did the law hunt him? Or did something far worse? The questions circled like vultures in her mind. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with each of his pain groans. It was not just fear of him, but the crushing, suffocating fear of consequence. She had chosen this path. She had invited this danger into their home, and now the weight of that choice settled upon her, heavier than the man she had dragged from the dust. As she finished, tying a crude bandage around his middle, she sat back on a stool, her body aching with an exhaustion that was more than physical. The stranger was still, his breathing a little deeper now. She had done all she could. She had kept him from the brink, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she had only pulled her own family closer to it. The long night stretched before them, a dark, unknown territory she now had to navigate alone. The days bled into nights, a rhythm measured only by the changing slant of light through the grimy windowpane and the rise and fall of the stranger's fever. Elara moved through a fog of exhaustion. Her world shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, the needs of her children, and the constant, low-level hum of the man's fight for life. He was a presence that filled every silence, a question mark lying on her husband's cot. It was during a long, suffocating night, when the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth, that the silence was first broken by a voice that wasn't his own. It was a rasp, a dry tearing sound from deep in his throat. Blackwood. The name was a shard of glass in the quiet room. Elara, dozing in her chair, jolted awake. It wasn't a call for help. It was a curse, a name spat from a place of old anger. She watched him, his brow furrowed, his head turning on the sweat-soaked pillow. He was wrestling not just with fever, but with a ghost. The name hung in the air, heavy and dark, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Who was Blackwood? The sound of it suggested splintered wood and cold iron, a man you didn't cross. She tried to dismiss it, to blame the sickness for the specter it had conjured. But the name came again in the days that followed, a recurring note in the fever's chaotic symphony. Then came the phrase, murmured into the pale light of dawn as she spooned a thin broth toward his lips, the devil's share. His eyes were closed, but his words were sharp, distinct. Can't have it. The devil's share. A chill, colder than any prairie wind, snaked down Elara's spine. The two fragments connected in her mind, locking together to form the outline of a terrible story. Blackwood. The devil's share. This was not the language of an honest man. It was the lexicon of backhouse deals, of theft and betrayal, of blood and money. The man she had saved, the man whose life she held in her hands, was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was a player in a dangerous game, and he had brought the consequences of that game to her door. Her apprehension curdled into a cold, hard fear. The pity she had felt for him began to recede, replaced by the terrifying realization that his past was not behind him. It was out there, somewhere on the plains, and it was likely looking for him. She had opened her home to a stray, only to find he was a wolf, trailing a far more dangerous predator right behind him. The stranger was no longer just a burden on her resources. He was a magnet for a violence she could not possibly withstand. The fever broke like a storm in the dead of night. One moment, his breathing was a ragged, shallow fight against an unseen enemy. The next, it was a deep, quiet surrender. When Elara brought a cup of water at dawn, she found him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. They were the color of a clouded sky, and in their depths, she saw not a devil, but a man who had been dragged through hell and left weary to the bone. He took the cup with a hand that trembled slightly, drank slowly, and when he was done, his voice was a dry rasp of sand and gravel. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a lifetime of death. He offered no name, no story, and Elara did not ask. The whispers of Blackwood and the devil's share were a wall of caution between them, a barrier her questions dared not breach. As his strength returned, a new, unspoken language formed. It was a language of action. He began with the small things, whittling a new handle for a pail, sharpening her worn-out axe, mending a loose board on the porch. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, his hands sure and competent, revealing a history of labor, not just violence. Elara watched him from the window, her suspicion warning with a grudging respect. He was mending the broken pieces of her homestead, and with each small repair, he seemed to be mending something broken within himself. The true bridge, however, was built by the children. Unburdened by adult fear, they saw not a threat, but a novelty. Leo, curious and brave, would sit silently and watch Silas work. It was Clara who broke the spell. She approached him one afternoon as he sat by the barn, a small, faded wildflower clutched in her fist, and held it out to him. The man froze. For a long moment, he just stared at the simple offering. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, his large, calloused fingers impossibly gentle. A flicker of something pained and beautiful crossed his face. He never spoke, but the next day, he presented Clara with a small, perfectly carved wooden bird. The gesture was a turning point. Seeing him with her daughter, seeing the profound gentleness he was capable of, chipped away at the wall Elara had built. The man who could whisper of devils in his sleep was the same man who could carve a miracle for a child. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of enemies, but the quiet, shared space of two people bound by a precarious circumstance. A fragile alliance had been formed, not with words or promises, but with a cup of water, a mended fence, and a wooden bird. The sun baked the homestead through 4 full cycles of the moon, and a silent rhythm had established itself. Silas, no longer the dying stranger, became a quiet fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the weathered barn and the endless sky. His presence was a strange anchor in Elara's turbulent world. He rose before the sun, his axe splitting the morning silence with a steady, reassuring beat. He repaired the sagging fence that had mocked her for a year, his hands moving with an expertise that spoke of a life lived outdoors. There was a comfort in having another capable adult, a buffer against the crushing solitude of the prairie. When he looked at her children, his gaze was soft, and on the rare occasion he spoke, his voice was a low rumble that did not frighten them. He was a good man, she thought, a man who deserved the life she had given back to him. But compassion has a cost, and the bill was coming due. The arithmetic hunger began its cruel, silent work. The sack of flour was a ghost of its former self, a limp shadow in the corner of the larder. The last of the cured meat was gone. The jar of beans was a landscape of rattling pebbles at the bottom of the glass. The nightly ritual of supper became a quiet torment for Elara. She would stand over the pot, her stomach clenched, thinning the stew with more water, trying to conjure substance from nothing. Then came the division. She'd spoon the watery mixture into the bowls. 4 bowls instead of 3. It was a simple act, yet it felt like a profound betrayal. Each spoonful she gave the stranger felt like a spoonful stolen from her own children. She saw the question in Leo's eyes after he'd finished his small portion, a quiet, hollow look that asked for more she could not give. Clara was growing thinner, the healthy roundness of her cheeks replaced by a fragile pale. The initial wrenchiousness of Elara's choice had curdled into a sickening knot of doubt. She had saved a man's life, but what was the price? Was this kindness? Or was it a foolish gamble made with the only things that mattered in her world? The moral dilemma was no longer a philosophical whisper, it was a gnawing ache in her children's bellies. Had she traded their future for his? The wind outside no longer sounded lonely, it sounded like an accusation, and it kept her awake long into the starless nights. It happened on an afternoon so still and quiet you could hear the sun buzzing in the air. Silas was by the fence, using a piece of scrap leather to reinforce the hinge on the gate, his movements economical and sure. Elara watched from the porch, shelling the last of their peas into a wooden bowl, a fragile piece having settled over the homestead. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It was in this quiet that Silas suddenly went rigid. His hands, which were never still, froze over the leather. His head lifted, not in a casual glance, but with the sharp, instinctive motion of a deer catching scent on the wind. Elara's fingers stopped their work. She followed his gaze out to the shimmering line where the scorched earth met the endless blue sky. At first, She saw nothing, just the vast, aching emptiness. Then her eyes caught it. A smudge, a tiny, dark speck, wavering in the heat haze, so insignificant it could have been a trick of the light. But it wasn't. It was moving, growing infinitesimally larger with a terrible, unhurried patience. A rider, a lone rider. The sight of it meant nothing to her, but it meant everything to Silas. The man she had come to know over the past weeks, the quiet helper, the gentle carver of wooden birds, vanished. In his place stood the man from the fevered dreams. The weariness in his eyes was burned away, replaced by a cold, hard focus, the look of a cornered animal that knows the hunter has finally found the trail. The lines around his mouth tightened into a grim slash. He dropped the leather and a tool, not with a clatter, but with a deliberate release, his body coiling with a tension that was both terrifying and formidable. He was no longer a guest. He was a sentinel, a man bracing for a war he had long been expecting. Elara's heart seized in her chest, a cold fist of dread. She didn't need to ask. She didn't need him to speak. The name, Blackwood, bloomed in her mind, no longer a fevered whisper but a name with a shape, a horse, and a direction. The slow-burn dread of their dwindling supplies was instantly extinguished, replaced by the white-hot terror of immediate, physical danger. The abstract consequence of her kindness had just been given a face, and it was riding steadily, inexorably, toward her home, toward her children. The peace was a lie. The waiting was over. The past was no longer a ghost. It was a man on a horse, and it was coming for them all. He didn't turn to face her. His eyes remained fixed on the approaching rider, a dark nail being hammered slowly into the coffin of their fragile peace. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until Elara's voice, barely a whisper, finally broke it. "You know him." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of terrible fact. For a long moment, Silas said nothing, the muscles in his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly thing, stripped of all warmth. "His name is Blackwood." The name she had heard in fevered whispers, now spoken into the clear, hot air, felt like an incantation, a summoning of a darkness they could not escape. He finally turned his head, his gaze meeting hers, and she saw the full weight of the past he had been carrying. It was a burden heavy enough to break a man, and she realized he had been broken for a long time. "He was my partner," Silas continued, the word partner tasting like poison in his own mouth. "We rode together for years, not for work, for taking." The confession hung between them, stark and ugly. He was a thief. The quiet man who fixed her fence and carved birds for her daughter had a history written in fear and stolen goods. There was a bank, he said, his eyes now looking at something far away, a memory burned behind his pupils. More money than a man could spend. But the cost was too high. The line we crossed. He didn't need to explain what that line was. She could see it in the haunted landscape of his face. "I took my share of the night and I rode. I thought if I rode far enough, fast enough, I could outrun the man I was." He let out a breath, a ragged, bitter sound. "But you can't outrun a man like Blackwood." It wasn't just about the money for him. It was the betrayal. To him, loyalty is the only law, and I broke it. He doesn't want the money back as much as he wants me. He wants what I have, and he wants to watch me lose it. Elara's world tilted. The man she had saved was a criminal. The food she had taken from her own children's mouths had fed a man running from a violent past. And now, that past had arrived. Blackwood wasn't just a rider, he was a reckoning. He was the devil, and Silas had brought him to her door to collect his share. The truth landed in the oppressive silence, a dead weight that sucked the air from Elara's lungs. A thief, a man whose past was a shadow with a gun, and that shadow was now riding toward her home. Every instinct for survival, every fiber of her maternal being, screamed a single, logical command: send him away, cast him out, let him take his war back to the empty plains where it belonged. He was a sickness she had nursed, and now that he was strong enough to walk, he had to leave before the contagion spread to her children. She could see them, Leo and Clara, their small faces pressed against the grimy window, their eyes wide with a fear they did not understand. Her choice was simple. It was him, or them. There was no room for both. She opened her mouth to speak the words, the cold, hard words that would save her family and condemn him. Leave. Now. But the words caught in her throat. Her gaze shifted from her children to Silas. He was not looking at the rider anymore. He was looking at her, and in his eyes she saw none of the hardened defiance she expected from a criminal. She saw a vast, desolate landscape of regret. She saw the ghost of the man he had been, at war with the man he was trying to become. She saw the thief, yes, but she also saw the man who had mended her fence with calloused, patient hands. She saw the outlaw, but she also saw the man whose face had softened with a pained tenderness when her daughter gave him a wildflower. He was her paradox, a man of violence and gentleness, a poison and, impossibly, a balm. He had brought this danger, but he had also brought a strange sense of security to their crushing loneliness. To send him out there now felt less like self-preservation and more like an execution. It was a betrayal of the fragile trust that had been built, not with words, but with shared meals and quiet work. In that long, stretched moment, her kindness underwent a profound alchemy. It ceased to be a simple, reactive pity for a wounded stranger. It transformed, hardening into a deliberate, powerful choice. It became allegiance. She turned from the window, her jaw set, and faced the two small figures. Leo, Clara. Inside, away from the window. Her voice was low and steady, a command that broke no argument. They scurried away. Then she looked at Silas, her eyes holding his, a silent contract passing between them. "You too," she said, her voice unwavering. "Get inside." The cabin door closed with a soft but definitive click, a simple sound that declared her choice to the world. They would face the devil together. The rider did not charge. He stopped just beyond the effective range of a rifle, a dark silhouette against the blood-red canvas of the setting sun. He sat on his horse for a long, quiet moment, a statue carved from vengeance, letting the weight of his presence settle over the small cabin like a shroud. Then, another figure emerged from the dust behind him, just as silent, just as still. There was no shout, no challenge, no ultimatum. The violence they brought was of a different, more patient, and far more cruel variety. With an unnerving lack of haste, the two men dismounted. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, unsaddling their horses and making camp. The metallic scrape of a coffee pot, the soft thud of a bedroll hitting the dirt, each ordinary sound was an act of psychological warfare. Soon, the flicker of a small fire bloomed in the twilight, a single, malevolent eye in the vast darkness. It was a declaration. "We are not leaving. We have time. You do not." Inside the cabin, the air grew thick and suffocating. The silence was a physical thing, a pressure against the eardrums, broken only by the frantic beat of Elara's heart and the shallow, controlled breaths of Silas beside her. He stood like stone, his face a mask of grim acceptance. He knew this game. This was Blackwood's art, to turn a man's sanctuary into his tomb, to let hope start before the body did. The great, open prairie, once a symbol of her isolating hardship, had now become the walls of a prison without bars. Every glance out the window was a torment, the small, taunting campfire a constant reminder of their dwindling time. Elara's mind began a frantic, terrifying inventory. The water in the rain barrel, how many days? The handful of flour left in the sack, how many meals? The last of the dried peas. Each resource was a grain of sand in an hourglass that had been turned, and outside, two men were content to simply sit and watch it run out. The siege had begun, not with the thunder of gunshots, but with the deafening roar of silence. They were trapped, held hostage by the vast, empty space and the patient evil that now occupied it. Death was not riding at them with a pistol drawn. It was seeping through the cracks in the walls, a slow, creeping poison of hunger, thirst, and despair. 2 days passed, each one a slow turn of a screw tightening the tension in the cabin. The water was gone. The last of the flour had been made into a thin, tasteless paste that did little to quiet the ache in the children's bellies. They no longer watched the window, but huddled in a corner, their small bodies limp with a weariness that cut Silas deeper than any bullet. He watched them, and in their hollow eyes, he saw the final, damning reflection of himself. He had spent his life running, a ghost pursued by his own choices, believing that motion was the same as freedom. But here, in this suffocating stillness, He understood the truth. He hadn't outrun his past. He had simply dragged it into the heart of this innocent family. The four walls of Elara's cabin had become a moral compass, and every direction pointed to a dead end. To flee now, to somehow slip away in the night, would be the ultimate act of cowardice, leaving them to Blackwood's cold mercy. To stay was to condemn them all to a slow, agonizing death by thirst. His internal war, the instinct to survive against the need to protect, raged in the silent prison of his mind. For years, the answer had always been the same: run. But the man who ran was not the same man who had watched Claire sleep with a small wooden bird clutched in her hand. He looked at Elara. She was staring out the window, her face a mask of exhausted resilience, a prairie rose determined to survive in barren soil. She had not condemned him for the truth. She had not cast him out. She had stood with him, a quiet act of allegiance that demanded an answer. The debt he owed her was not just for the breath in his lungs, but for the flicker of humanity she had rekindled in his soul. In that moment, the fight was over. The running was done. A profound, terrifying calm settled over him. He was no longer a man caught between fleeing and fighting. He was a man with a purpose. He would not be the victim, and he would not be the villain. He would be the shield. He turned from the window, his movement drawing Elara's gaze. The desperation was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim resolve that was absolute. "I'm going out there," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the thick silence. "I'm going to give him what he wants." Elara started to object, her eyes wide with fear for him, but he raised a hand, not to silence her, but to steady her. "Not what he thinks he wants," silence clarified, a strange, sad light in his eyes. "My share. On my terms." The cabin door creaked open, a sound swallowed by the vast, hostile silence. Silas stepped out into the blinding white heat, his hands empty, his shoulders squared. He did not carry a rifle. He carried the weight of his final choice. Each step he took toward the small, menacing campfire was a deliberate act, a pilgrimage away from the running man he had always been. Elara watched from the sliver of darkness in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. This was not the walk of a man going to a gunfight. It was the walk of a martyr. Blackwood rose as Silas approached, a lazy, predatory motion. His partner stood beside him, hand resting on his pistol. "Come to die, Silas?" Blackwood's voice was like grinding stones. Silas stopped a few feet away, the dust settling around his worn boots. "I came to pay the devil his share." He reached not for a weapon, but into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper, held together by a fraying ribbon. He held it out. "Your share. Take it." Blackwood stared, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "I'm not here for paper." "This paper," Silas said, his voice low and steady, "is worth more than all the gold we ever stole. It's the deed to the Red Canyon tract. 100 acres. Blackwood scoffed, but a flicker of something, curiosity, greed, stirred in his eyes. 100 acres of rock and dust? Silas shook his head. 100 acres, and the only deep water well for 50 miles in any direction. The one the railroad tried to buy. The one that never runs dry. The air shifted. The heat, the tension, the threat of violence, it all paused, eclipsed by the raw power of that statement. In this parched, unforgiving land, water was not life. It was a throne. To control the well was to own the land, the cattle, the men who would beg for a drop. It was a kingdom of dust and thirst. This was the miracle. Not a twist of fate, but a calculated sacrifice. The true treasure Silas had been hiding wasn't a bag of stolen coin. It was the one thing that could buy a future. "The deed," Silas said, his voice as solid as the rock beneath their feet, "for them. For her and her children. You take it. You ride away, and you never look back. That's the deal." Blackwood looked from the paper to Silas, and then to the small, desperate cabin. For the first time, a look of something other than pure malice crossed his face, a cold, pragmatic understanding. He stepped forward and snatched the deed from Silas's hand. The trade was made. A life for a life. A future for a future. A piece of paper for a soul. Blackwood did not look back. He folded the deed, a brittle promise of a new kingdom, and tucked it into his coat. He mounted his horse with the fluid motion of a man who had taken everything he came for, his eyes already fixed on a horizon that now belonged to him. Without a word, he and his companion turned their horses and rode away, two dark figures shrinking into the vastness until they were nothing more than a memory of a bad dream, swallowed by the prairie that kept all secrets. The silence they left behind was profound, a vacuum where the terror had been. It was a clean, hollow sound, the sound of a fever that had finally broken. Silas stood alone in the dust, a statue of a man who had given away his entire world. The cabin door opened, and Elara emerged, followed by the two small, tentative shadows of her children. They came to stand beside him, not touching, but connected by the shared space of their survival. As they stood there, the first sliver of dawn cracked the bruised purple of the horizon. A tenuous gold light spilled across the land, touching the warped wood of the cabin, the cracked earth, the tired lines on their faces. It was a slow, deliberate light, a promise whispered after a long night of screaming. Silas watched it, feeling the warmth on his skin. He was a man with nothing, no money, no deed, not even a horse to his name. He was a ghost on a homestead that wasn't his, with a future as empty as his pockets. And yet, as he felt the small, trusting weight of Clara's hand slipped into his own, he knew he had never been richer. He had found the one thing he had stopped looking for, a reason to stand still. Elara looked at the familiar, harsh landscape, but saw it for the first time. It was the same barren earth, the same struggling well, the same small home that had been her prison of hardship. But the light was new. The air was new. The crushing weight of solitude was gone, replaced by the quiet strength of the man standing beside her. This was the miracle. It hadn't fallen from the sky. It had been built, right here in the dust, from a stranger's pain, a woman's compassion, and a selfless, calculated sacrifice. The future was unwritten, a blank page waiting for their story. But for the first time, this small patch of unforgiving land felt less like a place of survival, and more like a place of hope. A home way. Help us tell more stories from the quiet frontier. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. You'll be the first to know when the next chapter arrives.